Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Leader to Leader podcast, the show where we dive into strategies, stories, and breakthrough moments that shape world-class leadership. I'm your host, Tom Athenour, and this episode is brought to you by the StarQuest Group. Today, we're narrowing our focus to the CEO position and the challenges that particular role faces within organizations. Perhaps you've heard that the average tenure of CEOs keeps dropping, and that, in fact, is true. In fact, the latest stats, the median, not the average, of a Fortune 500 CEO is just under 5 years, and it's expected that that tenure is only going to drop further as market demands change and the complexity of navigating these uncertain markets and the uncertainty just keeps increasing. Today, I'm joined by someone who knows CEOs well, having been one herself and having led multiple companies in that top leadership position, and one who knows what's going on really behind the curtains with CEOs today and what's going on with their executive team. My guest is Karen Posey, and she's managing partner of KP Strategies consulting firm based in Denver and is also an active board member on a couple of boards. She partners with executives to remove the obstacles that hinder innovation, execution, and sustainable growth, and focuses on a few different sectors, including healthcare, medtech, technology, IT, and government sectors. In this episode, Karen and I dig into what she sees behind that CEO curtain, which at times it feels like it's getting even closely more tightened up as CEOs navigate and kind of become more inwardly focused. Our conversation gets at everything from creating an executive first team to staying in touch with the industry trends and focusing on health and wellness, which really drives personal effectiveness. And so if you're currently in a CEO job, or if you have aspirations of becoming a CEO, one day you might stay tuned. You don't want to miss this episode. So let's jump in on my conversation with Karen. Karen, it is great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's such an exciting area in which you're playing right now in the of really helping predominantly mid-market companies, CEOs and C-suite players. Really, how do you create that enterprise value? Because it's not just about managing and operationalizing strategic objectives, but how do they step back and think about how do we create value from an organizational perspective? And there's a lot going on in CEO worlds these days. And so today we're going to be zeroing in on that particular role. So you may not be a CEO, but maybe you have aspirations to ultimately get there. Or maybe you're a divisional senior vice president or even a president. I think what you're going to get from today's conversation is some really good insights and ideas around how do you create value in the domain in which you're playing. So I think it's a great topic, very timely as leadership is changing out there and companies are under a lot of pressure for performance. So when we talk about enterprise value, would you just define that for our listeners?
Happy to do it because, it's interesting, Tom. When I talk to people about it, the first thing they think about is, oh, that's valuation, that's growth. It's not. Those are outputs. What I'm really talking about is enterprise value is moving upstream. It's strategy. It's what I call your first team, which is your C-suite. Hopefully we can unpack that a little bit later in the conversation, but it's strategy, it's first team, it's your operating model. It's also your capital decisions. All that makes up how you drive enterprise value. And I find a lot of CEOs don't think of it like that, and boards as well.
Yeah. And so how do they define it? What types of definitions are you hearing out there where there's confusion? Is it more operationally, internally focused, or what?
Yeah, it's interesting. I find, depending on our CEOs, my expertise is in the mid-market. I've certainly consulted with Fortune 500 companies and whatnot, but where I've spent the last almost 10 years has been in the mid-market. And it's just that it's hard sometimes for CEOs in the growth mode to run or move from kind of running that business to designing that business. And that takes a lot of discipline, because it's easy to get caught up in the day to day. It's easy to get monkeys to be put on your back.
Yeah.
It's that personal effectiveness of the CEO is, I also talk about, the 6 things that only a CEO can do. And one of them is personal effectiveness. And it really plays a critical role in where are you spending your time? Where's the first team spending their time? And it needs to be on how you drive and how you design enterprise value, because what I love about the mid-market is what got you here where you are today isn't going to get you to the next level.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so you've got to constantly be pushing, and you got to be more creative because you don't have the resources that a Fortune 500 has.
So when you talk about designing the business, was that what the term that you used, designing a business?
Yeah.
Is that around clarity of mission or vision, or and business models and things along those lines? Is that what you're talking about relative to
Yes.
designing it?
Yes. The vision clarity. What is the vision? And does everyone in the organization know it? When from the most entry level person up through the organization, do they really understand where you're trying to take the company? It's also your first team. I joke a lot about the first team, but I really view it as a family. There's always a level of dysfunction in any first team. And so how do you really get them aligned and accountable? And that sounds so easy, but candidly, every organization I've been in, and I can't think of any exceptions, there's always that level of dysfunction, and getting that first team to truly act like the first team. It's a Patrick Lencioni fan, or I'm a Patrick Lencioni fan. And I love this term because let's say you're the CFO or CHRO or VP of sales, whatever, you're responsible for a functional area. Well, that's your second team. Your first team is that C-suite, and you need to focus on, and the CEO needs your focus and needs to drive the focus on solving the biggest problems the company faces. Yes, you have your second team responsibility, but how are you working together as a first team? Because if you're not driving enterprise value. And that's just one lever. I mean, vision clarity, first team, also the whole governance of it. How do we make decisions? How do we decide who decides? Right? These things sound so easy, but implementing them is much, much harder.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the first team,
Yeah.
and because I think that's a really relevant of that alignment and getting people on the same page and rowing in the same direction. But it's more than that. It's more around how do they start to think as from an enterprise wide perspective as opposed to a functional or divisional or whatnot. Is that how do you help those CEOs work with their executive teams to get that first team to be how they think? Because I'm going to be my performance is based upon what results I drive in my functional area, right? It's not
Right.
so it is at the enterprise level, but I can get my arms around my functional. So how do you coach CEOs to get their guys to think a little bit, men and women, to think differently relative to kind of that first team concept?
Yeah, it's really 3 things. It's really, first of all, the components of the first team. So, do you have the right players on the team? And that sounds so simple, but there's a lot of complexity there because a lot of times you might not. And, depending on, I've certainly worked with CEOs that don't like conflict.
Yeah.
That causes a lot of problems when it comes to, making sure you've got the right first team that can truly work together and that they're all carrying their own weight. I tend to find that several people on the team tend to carry more weight than others just because the CEO, for all probably the right reasons, that someone is still there that maybe shouldn't be because you might have outgrown them. So really looking at that team component, right? Then also teamwork practices. Are you really making the first team the first team? And what I mean by that is I find a common pitfall that CEOs get into is that they will, unintentionally, of course, everybody has one-on-ones with members of their first team as a CEO. The challenge is you want to have those, But that can't be the only meeting you have. You've got to really make that first team a high performing team, because what happens is the pitfall is when CEOs meet predominantly with people one-on-one, the CEO is creating silos and they don't even realize it. You've got to expect the first team to really work together and be that star of, that team needs to be the star, right? Not individuals, but the team needs to be the star. And then the third thing is, what's that operating rhythm that you're going to work on? So as I coach and work with CEOs in the first team, it's the classic. You look at a year and you break it down, taking, at the end of the year and work backwards with the end in mind. When should you be doing your strategic planning? What should you be doing on a quarterly basis, a monthly basis, a weekly basis? And I got to tell you, every company's different. I work with all different industries. It really, I hate to use the term, the typical consulting term, but it does depend, right?
Right.
On the
Right.
company and in the makeup of the company. So I usually do a lot of discovery to understand what really, what's important and how are they making decisions today to really best guide them and the company on what's the right operating rhythm for them, because that's a big piece of it.
So if I'm a CEO, and if I could just summarize that real briefly for our listeners, what I'm hearing is that if I'm in that CEO role or very senior executive level, and I've got some things I'm really trying, how do we collectively create value for our organization, whatever our domain or span, I would be asking myself, do I truly have a first team or do I have a group of functional representatives that just get together to do
Exactly.
report outs, you know?
Exactly. Tom, you're exactly right. And I got to tell you, more than not, I find they've got a group of individuals that are very good at what they do individually, but they do not know how to work together as a first team, and they're not solving the biggest problems the company faces. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's
Okay.
take sales, right?
Yeah.
It's easy for people to say, our sales are lagging, dock on it. Our, chief revenue officer, what are you doing? What are your team doing? What's your team doing? But if you take a step back, is there product quality issues? Are we having customer experience issues that we're not resolving? Right? What's really driving the maybe flat growth or marginal growth? It's usually a bigger picture. It's like anything else. There's no silver bullet. So
Sure.
what are you really doing as a team to figure this out, get to the root of the problem, and gosh, solve the problem, and then let's
Right.
move on, right? Because there's bigger fish to fry.
Right. Right. So getting them to think not just it's the functional leads, it's their problem. It really
Right.
impacts the enterprise values. Sort of the common denominator that we can all rally around is how do we create enterprise value is that North Star. That's what we're trying to do.
That's right.
However we define that, right?
Right, right. And
Okay.
you take a typical mid-market company, and as I mentioned, what typically will get you, what got you where you are today, isn't going to get you to the next level. So
Yeah.
there are points in time where you've got to look at your organizational design. You've got a zero base. There's ebbs and flows, and that's why looking at your operating model, looking at your strategy, looking at your first team, being upstream, and then really looking at those capital decisions. One of my favorite books, I still refer to it to this day, is Fit for Growth, because the other decision is, you can't do everything. And I find specifically in the mid-market, this is so hard because somebody comes up with a great idea and everybody wants to run to that great idea. But you've really got to do some market intelligence and really have the outside in perspective to make sure you're really focused on the right things. Because what happens is, before you know it, it's the creepy crawl that all of a sudden you're doing everything and nothing is mapped back to your operating model and your core competencies to really understand, hey, what's our sweet spot? Where do we need to partner? Where do we need to maybe make an acquisition? But more importantly than anything, what do we need to stop doing, right? Because you can't do everything. And so you've
Sure.
got it. The reason I love the Fit for Growth is that basically the principle is, what are we going to stop doing? so that we can hit the gas on and really put our funds towards the growth areas of the company. And believe me, I make it sound simple. It's really hard.
Yes.
It's hard to give up sacred cows, beautiful babies that have been around for a long time, but maybe the margins aren't where they need to be anymore.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able to separate yourself from that and make the best decisions as a group for the company to continue to grow. Because if you're not doing this stuff, you're already dead and you don't know it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot in that. First of all, identifying like the blueprint of what are some of the business aspects that are supportive of enterprise value. So I see that, which is a lot of the vision clarity around taking a look at competitive advantages and all those classic, what I would consider to be classic business areas of focus. The other thing that you mentioned, there were three things. The second one was around team member practices, like operating norms is what I think of, but it's really about how does the team collectively come together and collaborate better towards what it is they're trying to solve, as opposed to taking a group. It's a team sport rather than a bunch of individuals on a tennis team versus a soccer team. You're all interdependent, right?
That's right.
That's what.
And absolutely. And the great CEOs know how to do that really, really well.
Yeah.
Really well.
Yep. And then the last thing I think is really important that we sometimes forget is CEOs need to think about what's our operating rhythm. And I like that term. It's the cadence. When do we get together as a team? When do we have functional readouts and all of that? So those are the three things you see as a sort of first line of defense, if you will, in working with CEOs. Do you find that
as it relates to their first team, for sure?
Yeah. So relative to the first team, what do you see as common potential areas or common gaps, things that are missing?
I definitely see that functional leads, members of the first team, they're used to working in their silo and they stick to their silo. So when it comes time to solve problems, like the example I gave of we're having some growth issues. Well, that's Bill's problem or that's Sue's problem. And they check out. And, then I find, another common pitfall when you're not focused on all three aspects of the first team is you get into the weekly meetings and they're not valuable and everybody dreads going to them because they're not moving the needle. They're not moving the business forward. They just feel like they're constantly rehashing things. They're not making decisions. They're not moving forward. So there seriously is a level of dysfunction because they haven't talked about how are we really architecting the business? What are the governance and decisions? Who owns them? Who's accountable? And really holding people accountable to truly do that. Yeah. It's so important. And these all sound so easy, but in the day-to-day with everything you've got going on, one of the 6 things, correlating back to the 6 things that only a CEO can do, one of them also is the first team. And why is that? Because it'll make or break your company. And that's why you will always have an amazing company.
Yeah. It's so fascinating and I can see where that is something that takes a lot of influence and even working and getting people on board and getting some excitement and passion around where the business is going as a way to pull people together towards that common mission or what are we driving towards? And then being able to measure the things that are really going to your point about, are we even moving the needle on the things that matter? Having that line of sight, I think, is so critical. Do you find that CEOs get into a situation where they keep trying to use the same things that they've always done that may not be getting the results, but there's almost like a push harder on that agenda as opposed to stepping back and really asking for feedback from other points of view, or it's almost like internal benchmarking against ourselves versus external benchmarking? We need to zoom back a little bit. Do you see that as being something CEOs tend not to do as well, particularly mid-market companies?
Yeah, and I really call it engaging stakeholders. And I think it's so important because stakeholders are not only partners, their employees, and their customers. So when you think about those stakeholders, so for example, CEOs I work with, I ask them, all right, so what skip level lunches or breakfasts or coffees have you had? And most people are like, well, what do you mean by skip level? Well, okay, you take the CEO and then you take a member of their first team, it's skipping below. So let's say it's someone at a director level, maybe it's a manager, maybe it's just an individual contributor, but getting down in the organization and garnering feedback. Now, I also caution CEOs, you can't take one customer's feedback, one employee's feedback, and change direction. You need that what I call the market collective. And that could be, a group of CEOs, depending on the size of the organization. Organizations, when they get to, I'd say, at least the ones I work with, 75 million to 100 million, they're really focused on the customer experience. They're trying to build that out. Having an employee council, I think, is extremely valuable because you've got to be able to develop your talent. We'll talk about this a little later, but we are moving into there's a leadership crisis already ahead of us. And so it's really important that, especially in the mid-market, because you can't buy enough talent. You don't have the funds for that. So it's, what are you really doing to harness the feedback from your employees, and not only harnessing that feedback, but using it as an opportunity to develop them too. Because, one of the things that I coach even first team members on is, what are the things that only also you can do? And as you think of your team, right? Not only does the CEO need to be thinking that, but the first team and every leader down from that needs to be thinking about, what are the things that only I can do, and what do I need to let others on my team do? I think that's an important piece. But getting back to the heart of your question is, I really think it's all about making sure that CEOs engage those stakeholders and really have that perspective. And from a customer standpoint, and partners, beyond feature function, I'm talking about your top customers, Pareto principle, having those relationships and discussions at a decision maker level to really gain insight. It's so important. If we have time, I'm happy to give you a quick example where I saved a division president over 25 million over the life of their product, just because of this very issue.
Yeah. Let's get an example. I would love to
Okay.
know what happened, real specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was the division president of a major Fortune 100 company. They wanted to take a direction on a specific product. We got together there. They had a customer advisory board, all decision makers of their biggest customers. They presented their idea to them. And then I put them in a 90-minute session where I asked, a lot of questions. And bottom line is, after the 90-minute session, they came back and they presented to the division president and his team and basically said, we don't see you here. We would never buy this from you. We see this company is number one. This company is number two in the market. You're just not in that space. The division president at the end of the day hugged me because I wasn't sure how this was going to go. Nobody likes to be told no, right? Yeah. But he hugged me and he said, you saved us $5 million in upfront cost and $25 million over the life of the product. And it just goes to show you can't, listen to one customer and change the trajectory of your company. But I asked him, I said, so what made you think that you wanted to get in this market? Because you guys have never been there. And they said, well, our salespeople, talked to all the users and the users wanted it. Well, that's where I was mentioning again, this isn't about feature function. And that's where I think a lot of companies fail here because they're just a feature function.
Yeah. So when you talk about, is it because they were giving feedback from the users, and so it was almost like a scope creep, or it was a migration from the core of what that company was best known for, and they got outside their lane a bit, but in trying to respond to the users' requests? Is that what happened?
Yes. And actually, though, what their advisory council, again, decision makers at, their biggest customers said, but here's where we'd like to see you go, right? Again, think of back to the Venn diagram, it's business model core competencies. Here's where we'd like to see you go. Here are future ways that maybe you can acquire a company or you can partner with a company, because here's where we would buy more from you if you did this. And don't get me wrong, I want to be careful for the listeners. You need feature function information and user level insight when you're building various products. But when it comes down to strategy and direction and where you're going to go and where you're going to place your bets, because you only have so many bets as a CEO and a first team, I really hope you have that insight from your biggest customers at a decision maker level. You have market intelligence and the outside in perspective from various stakeholders to guide you. Because otherwise, I've seen so many companies waste millions and millions and millions. And there's a Fortune 50 that we'll talk about it offline that is actually wasted billions, and they still can't figure it out because they keep acquiring companies, but still treating it like their traditional model, their traditional operating model.
Okay.
And they can't figure out why they're still not the leader in the market. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So from what I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from a CEO, that real clarity around where we're going, what value we create for our customers. Because what I heard in that example of the focus group that you conducted, where there was just this gap in why they weren't winning the business that they should have, because they were not, it's almost kind of like they became too, I would guess they might have come too organizationally centric as opposed to more of that customer. So they've lost touch with that customer.
Right.
Then be surprised that this is the reason why they were not getting their market share or getting the deals that they thought they should be getting. Is it getting too extended that CEOs need to be questioning whether that's the line of business we want to go into? How do they get off track, I guess, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
There's a lack of that clarity. Yeah.
There is a lack of clarity, and it's easy to get off track if your salespeople, which are doing their job, they're doing a great job. So this is, please, anybody listening, don't think I'm bashing salespeople. I'm not. No. But depending on the level your salespeople call on, and their salespeople called on, the typical lower level folks within their client base, you get a different perspective. And I guess really the point is, as a CEO and a first team, you've got to take a step back and make sure you understand who's, knowing who writes the checks and who truly are those purse strings owners. That's where you need the insight.
Yeah.
And so for mid-market companies, let's take this back to mid-market. I always counsel, you get to a certain size, I'm a huge advocate for having an executive level customer advisory board, right? Because if you're 150 million and you want to get to 300 million, it's a great strategy to make sure that you've got your biggest clients. Because guess what happens? If you're meeting with them twice a year and then you're having some quarterlies in between, you're building relationships, executive to executive, and it goes beyond the salespeople. It's a great strategy. You get even closer to your biggest customers, which who doesn't want that? Yeah. And look at all if it's orchestrated well and you're asking the right questions and you're focused on your strategy, it's a great opportunity to get that outside in perspective. And then, of course, if you are big enough and you've got a board as well, running the strategy by the board, it helps. So you've really got two different sounding boards. Yeah.
This is really great, because what I'm hearing is being so critical. There's a theme there, because you talked about the importance of having CEOs having internal stakeholder groups, of getting some feedback as to what's really going on. You talked about having skip connections or skip meetings and stuff like that. I like the idea of bringing them together so it doesn't look like you're compromising hierarchy and authorities and all that stuff, where that could get messy. But having stakeholder groups to gather that internal, but you're also talking about, let's not just get focused internally, let's go to the outside and focus on the customer feedback and really making sure that we're we have that strong connection with our customers and we're meeting their needs, but not getting so farly extended away from our core competencies that we start to dilute our competitive edge. That's what I'm hearing from you as being two areas, just to make sure that
Yeah.
we're on this. Yeah. Okay.
We're
This
definitely on
is
the
good.
same page. And then
Yeah.
you add in your partners, right?
Yeah.
And you think about supply chain and
Yeah.
how you can
Yeah.
simplify supply chain. Oh my gosh, if you're not leveraging your partners to do that or help you win more business,
Yeah.
what a missed opportunity. You know, a lot of this honestly is working smarter versus harder, right? It's leveraging the resources you have and investing the time there
Yeah.
because it really will pay off.
Yeah.
I mean, I know a lot of companies that have those executive level advisory boards. That's how they've made every major acquisition. If they've been in heavy growth mode, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a great strategy to give you perspective. That and guidance of your board, it's there's nothing better to accelerate enterprise value.
Yeah. You talked about the leadership crisis. Is the
Mhm.
crisis around, I want to go back to that point you made. Is the leadership crisis around not having competent, well, kind of strategic leaders to take over these CEO roles? Or is it that things are changing so fast that they can't keep up with it? What do you mean by leadership crisis? And what is it?
Yeah, it's really the leadership crisis that's happening is especially in the mid market. It's really all about it's not a talent gap anymore. You know, for years we've heard about we need talent. It's talent. It's we need real leaders. And there's just as a lot of CEOs are starting to retire, there's going to be a big gap of people that are strong leaders and those that aren't. And you know, Tom, you and I both saw the pendulum years ago. People were smothered with leadership training, right? You had potential. Then we went through a big gap where for 5, 7 years, maybe even 10, there wasn't a lot of, I mean, companies invested in leadership, but not to the level they were. Now we're seeing the focus again. But, you know, for mid market, it's tough because there's different strategies you've got to use
Yeah.
to really grow your talent because you're not a Fortune 500 company that can just go hire, you know, this talent and it's going to become more and more scarce, the people that really have the skills needed to move the needle. So what you have to do in the mid market is you've got to really develop that talent. So anybody listening is going, well, gosh, Karen, that's, you know, thank you for being master of the office.
Sure.
But
Sure.
how do you do that? Right. And how
Yeah.
you do that is you really, couple ways. You start giving, well, first of all, you take a step back and have you really evaluated your talent in your organization? I've been amazed personally at 75, 85, almost $100 million companies that don't even do a basic 9 box of their
Yeah.
talent.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, in my opinion, it's a real crime because you've got to understand who are your high potentials, who really are your top leaders, and then what are you doing to develop the leaders that have those future leaders that have that potential. So are you giving them extra responsibility and making it a big deal, right? Not just giving them more responsibility, but letting everybody in the organization know that you're giving this to them because they have performed. Are you moving people around in the organization to give them more exposure to the enterprise value, the strategy, the first team, your operating model as the business, right? Your capital decisions. Are you giving them positions that give them the exposure to all that and moving people around? And granted, I'm not saying for a second this is easy, but it's got to be done in the mid market. And I see a lot of companies want to keep Sue or Bill in the same position. And you
Yeah.
can't do that. You got to
Right.
constantly be moving people around. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that we were talking about in the pre-episode discussion meeting that we had, you were talking about how boards and CEOs really need to rethink about leadership development as being linked to driving that enterprise value. Explain to me uh, what that rethinking needs to look like. I mean, I have my assumptions, moving from training, which oftentimes that gets dumped into to more of a development focus, which is training is a piece of it, but you're talking about moving people around for different experiences and that uh, functional understanding of the enterprise, and some of that's development. Expound on me. What needs to be rethought? How do we need to rethink it at the CEO level?
Yeah, good question, Tom. I think the best way to rethink it is to really look at where you are and where you want to go as an organization, and know that if you really want to be successful in the mid-market, you've got to figure out, you got to create some level of infrastructure to grow your talent, to grow your leadership. And so in my opinion, it first starts there. Is, okay, we've said this is important. How are we going to do it? It's one thing to talk about it, but how are we going to do it? And how are we going to make these moves and changes in the organization? And again, it goes back to the first team, because this isn't an HR problem. And that's where I find a lot of people look to the CHRO, the chief, human resources officer, and say, okay, what's your plan? This has got to be a part of the strategic plan. So that's first and foremost. It's got to be a part of the strategic plan. What are we doing to really grow our leadership? Also, the leadership crisis really also looks at some of the articles that are out there, Tom, look at CEO succession. And there's a lot of talk on that, but also that's got to be in, depending on the company, especially if you're a family owned business, this gets very sensitive. So I want to be, mindful of that. But you've got to have a level of succession and discussion in this. The strategic plan has to cover that. And you've got to be looking at who are those leaders that could be the future CEO, and start with 3 and start to work your way down. I tend to find the CEO gets tired, and about a year before they want to retire, or 6 months, then they look up and go, hey, I need to find a successor.
Sure. I
If,
see that. Yeah.
Right. And everybody's scrambling, right? You can't do that. And then I think the other piece that's critical to growing talent leadership in the company is it, I know I keep going back to this, but it's a make or break for any company. It's the leadership team. It's the first team. So when you look at your first team, are you holding them accountable? Because it's hard to develop future leaders if your current first team is not delivering on the enterprise value. So that's why I keep going back. You've got to get this right with your first team first as you make these shifts and moves. Because, going back, let's take another example. If each member of the first team still thinks of their second team, their functional area, as the first team, well, first of all, we both know what happens. Well, I don't want to guild Bill up to take that assignment. He's my top player, right? Sure. I don't want to do that. You can't take so-and-so. It gets very political. When the first team acts like the star, they're the star of the team, and they are focused on, that team, what makes that team successful, then Bill and Sue and the top performers, everybody can link hands and know that they're making the best sacrifice for the long-term value of the company. Yes. And I think that's so important. And I'd even say, as a side note, I'm so passionate about the first team, and I know you can tell that. Sorry, everyone. But, if you're fortunate enough to have all of your leaders in the same building, have your first team sit next to each other, not with their functional area. That sounds so simple, but it sends a very strong message that where their priorities are and what the company's priority is.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's a reframe around thinking through our talent. And I heard, a really good sort of thoughtful and analytical way to diagnose, from an objective perspective versus subjective, which I know that plays in a lot. Well, this guy's they're doing a great job, and they're real close to this, and it's sort of the political thing. You gotta be able to cut through that and look at the competence and capabilities to your 9 box. And for those of you that are not familiar with the 9 box, it's a current performance level versus on the horizontal, and then potential on the vertical. And then you think about your talent base and start to evaluate on those 2 dimensions, current state plus future. And you start to get an idea against what are the job requirements and what is the potential on that. So I get the diagnostic part of it and bringing some science into that. I think what I'm also hearing is that we need to broaden the definition of leadership development. And we're very passionate about that at StarQuest, as you well know. You and I have talked about that, of if this is beyond training, and that it really is the first team's responsibility to own the development of their talent as they start to look at continuation and legacies, and how do we keep our organization relevant in the new marketplace, because things are changing really quickly. That's how it's sum that up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said, Tom.
It's such an interesting side of things. If I were a CEO, and if we wanted to, if there were like 3 things that you think are most important for me to really step back, it's the beginning of the year. Everybody's doing a little bit of a reset reflection. If there were 3 things that you would really challenge me to zero in on, what would those 3 most critical, vital elements be, or things to think about?
Yeah. First and foremost, you've got a vision. Hopefully it's a vision that's 10 years out. And then you have a strategic intent that's 3 years out that you can really focus, but make sure everyone in the organization knows what that is. Vision clarity is critical, and that is a critical responsibility of the CEO. Second is...
Okay, hang on. On the vision clarity, it's really about how do we see our organization? What's our organization going to look like in 10 years, 5 years, whatever it is? And be able to paint a picture of that. It's beyond just we're going to get from, 100 million or whatever to 150 million or whatever it is. It's really painting a picture of what it's going to be like here to work in an organization. Is that correct around vision?
It is.
It's mixed up all the time.
It does. And, mission is timeless. Vision is 10 years out. But I think we'd all agree, all the listeners would agree as well. It's one thing to have a vision 10 years out. And I think that's great. What do you want the headline for your company to be? What do you want us to look like?
Okay.
But that's why I'm a big proponent of strategic intent, which is 3 years out, because I think any company today, it's hard. Things move way too quickly. And 3 years is about as far as you can plan out in your strategic planning process. And you're revisiting it quarterly anyway, but 3 years is about it. So having that strategic intent for 3 years in line with your 10-year vision, I think is so important. So strategic clarity, and then making sure everybody knows what those are, right? So that they're moving towards that. So vision clarity is number 1.
I got that one. Yes. This is great.
First team. I know we talked a lot about the first team today, but even when you're a startup, the first team doesn't go away, because people, I used to work with a lot of startups in the healthcare med tech space. And, what do people want to know? Okay, your widget, great. That's just getting you in the door. What we really want to know is, let's look at your leadership. Let's look at your first team. Let's look at your total addressable market. What's the potential of your organization? But the first team carries a ton of weight, and it doesn't change. It doesn't change. Yeah. So first team, second. The third is, as a CEO, focus on your personal effectiveness. You've got to be the architect. You're the only one besides your board that can architect enterprise value. You've got to move from running the business to designing the business. And that is a fundamental shift every CEO has to be doing. And it's hard. I'm not saying this is easy work, but that is critical to success.
So personal effectiveness, are you talking about your individual competence in the sense of growing your leadership capabilities? Or are you talking about fitness and health and wellness and taking care of yourself? Or is it all the above?
It's all the above. Yeah, it's what's your leadership perspective? What's your leadership model? So what do you stand for? What won't you tolerate? What gives you energy? What depletes your energy, right? How do you design? And when I think about what depletes your energy, what gives you energy, your time management, right? Where are you spending your time, right? And it hopefully is on things that are giving you energy, and you're delegating all the things that deplete your energy, unless, there's always some things you can't. But
Okay.
yes,
Yeah.
it's those kind of things. And then looking at the effectiveness overall of, are you designing?
Yep.
Are you running the business?
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good way to think about it. Am I designing what I'm wanting to create here, or am I just getting too into the tactical day to day and not bringing
Right.
longer term perspective? Yeah, I know we've been zeroing in a lot these days on energy management, and that's what I heard too. How are you managing your energy and getting rid of some of the stuff that is the energy depletion, and really focusing in on the things that brings that energy, because it's a tough job. The reason
It is a tough job.
CEO crisis is, or leadership crisis is, it's a tough job, and not everybody says yes to it. And we're looking at some of the demographic data around some of the younger generations. They're not all that excited about taking on those leadership roles. And so it's like, wow, we got to do something in preparation. Karen, this was meant absolutely fascinating to think about enterprise value and how do we accelerate that, and how do we as CEOs, but even it's broader than that. It's the C-suite, the senior leaders in organizations, to start to think about the importance of first team and building the talent and development. How do we broaden that? This has been so interesting. You work with a lot of CEOs. You're a busy person. It took us a long time to get this thing scheduled. And so I'm grateful for the time that you've shared and some insights. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. So we're in the show notes to all of our listeners. We will include some resources that Karen will provide to us, including how you all can get a hold of Karen should you so desired. And so we'll include those in the show notes. And for all of our listeners out there, if you've enjoyed these podcasts and these episodes, please do go on your favorite podcast platform and like us, or if you feel so inclined, give us a rating, because that does help us get noticed on all these different platforms. And so thank you all for listening. And as we always end, Karen, we always talk about the importance that we have a saying that leaders bring the weather. And as leaders, we have a lot more influence on what we bring to our organizations based upon how we show up in the leadership to which we bring to our teams and organizations, and even the one-on-ones. And so we try to get all these different perspectives. And today it's been about the CEO and that C-suite up on top. And so CEOs are the biggest weather pattern bringer-uppers. They bring the weather, and it cascades around. So if you're a CEO out there, I want to believe you want to be a CEO someday, it does matter how you show up. So with that, we'll end. Thank you for the time, Karen. It's been a pleasure.
All right. That is a wrap for this episode. That was an interesting discussion. The role of a CEO is truly fascinating, especially when you think about the growing demands and the pressures of leading organizations today, and all the tumultuousness and the uncertainty of what's happening out there. One of the big themes that really stood out in our conversation was just how isolating that can be, and overwhelming that CEOs can feel, and how that experience does not only just affect them, but it actually has a ripple effect throughout the entire organization. We wrap things up with a really important reminder about personal effectiveness. It's about setting boundaries, protecting your health, taking care of your overall well-being. And we all know how important that is, and yet it's often the first thing to slip as work takes up more and more of our time and energy. If you want a quick summary of the key takeaways, be sure to check out the show notes. We've also included a few additional resources there if you'd like to dive deeper. 2 books that I listed were both by McKinsey Partners. One is called The Journey of Leadership, and the second one, the sequel, is called A CEO for All Seasons. Both of them are outstanding. They came out within the last 12 months. If you have questions for Karen or ideas for future guests for us, you can reach out to us at team@starquestgroup.com. And you can also find Karen's contact information in the show notes. And so, until next time, stay present, stay curious, and don't hesitate to engage with others. And most importantly, take care of yourselves. It really does matter. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.